Welcome Ape Army, this is Ape Factory here for another exciting and totally necessary video. This time we're going to look at the riveting world of bushings, specifically the wear-prone upper control arm bushings at the front. Audi must consider these normal wear items as they're an issue across the entire line from the A5 to the RS5 as well as the 4 Series cars. Why is that? The main culprit is the bonded rubber bushing. Sexy. Each has a void that can only be deflected so much. Eventually they all tear as a result of the design and the increased weight over the front wheels. Think of it as a 911 in reverse. I like to enjoy the car, and I particularly enjoy it on the back roads of Mexico. You know the spot. I usually can be seen with my computer in tow, logging various parameters and collecting data for analysis later on. One thing I've noticed in my time there is the concept of billiard smooth doesn't exist here, and apparently neither does camber. The only thing these road pavers understood is negative camber. Makes it pretty interesting. Nonetheless, compliance is an important factor in going quickly and comfortably. The original bushings have plenty of give and keep road noise to a minimum. With that said, let's go off the deep end. After experimenting with exactly one polyurethane bushing for the last 2 years, I decided to go all out and install a set of race bushings. These are fairly high on the durometer scale and are listed for track day and race cars. That's all well and good, but I'm replacing a total of 4 bushings. I can't imagine they'd be all that bad. One issue poly bushings have is they tend to squeak. Sooner than later. They always will, and there's no way to avoid it. I experienced it with my single poly bushing, and it sounded like a squeaky spring, which is just the sort of sound you want everyone to hear coming out of your RS5. I did manage to put that noise off for about 2 years with the help of a wonder lubricant called Krytox. This stuff was invented for NASA, and it really is sexy in a bottle. You'll pay for it too. It isn't cheap. As they say, a little goes a long way, so don't let the small bottle scare you. I use it to lube just about everything from squeaking bump stops to the aforementioned poly bushings. More on that later though. Hitting the back roads, I knew something was amiss in my car, specifically its propensity to turn left as opposed to right. And it really wasn't just because I was an American. Something was up, and it turned out to be 2 different things. First, I had a bad bushing on the driver's side. Second, I had a bad end link, which I'll touch on in another video. Knowing this was going to be a recurring problem, I'd really had enough, and I started to look at the poly bushings and their lifetime warranty. Looks pretty good. It could go horribly wrong, but at least you'll all be there with me in spirit when it does. With that said, there are a few basic items you'll need, including new bushings as well as a full set of replacement nuts and bolts for the control arm and the pinch bolt and the suspension upright. New bolts are mandatory, being one-time use, torque to yield, or stretch bolts. Do not overlook this step. You can source them individually by part number or purchase a kit with the necessary bolts through a company like ECS Tuning. All told, you'll have 6 bolts and 6 nuts, and the cost is just under $50 for the set. In addition to those, you'll want a good set of wrenches, particularly 16mm, along with a torque wrench, metric sockets, a jack, impact gun, jack stands, a bushing removal kit, and a very loyal dog to manage you as you work. The bushing removal kit can be found on places like Amazon, and it makes the whole process fairly easy. If it is your first rodeo, a factory service manual is also a really good idea. You'll begin by jacking the car up on either side and placing your jack stands in the appropriate place. With the wheels removed, you'll have full access to the control arms, and there's a fairly good amount of room to work with. One tip, remove the suspension strut tower cover in the engine bay and point a work light through it. It'll increase visibility and make the job that much easier. What we're looking at, besides a very dirty wheel well, is the removal of 3 sets of nuts and bolts per side. Honestly, it's fairly simple. Remove the suspension upright pinch bolt first. These are torqued down at a very low setting, so they're very easy to get off. With the nut removed, you may need a screwdriver or punch to push the bolt all the way out. The inner nuts on the upper control arm are also fairly easy to remove. No 3-foot breaker bar needed. They may take a little bit of effort, but you'll be able to get them off with just hand power. Depending on how the spring windings sit, the bolts may be super easy to get out or somewhat difficult, but they will come out. If that isn't the case, removing the 4 strut tower bolts and lowering the entire assembly may give you a bit better access. I'd only do that as a last resort. Truth be told, it'll take you half an hour to remove all 3 bolts on one side. It'll take you 4 times longer to get them back in. You have been warned. As I said, this task isn't overly difficult, but it can be a test in frustration management. Sometimes the alignment of various items makes it much harder than it has to be. With everything removed, you'll rinse and repeat on the other side. Looking over the bushings, almost all of them had small cracks in the rubber portion. Some were better than others, but the car will benefit from having all 4 changed. One surprise I did come across were the outer spherical bearings. I hadn't even considered these may be bad. 2 of the bearings were, both on the trailing arm, which is quite interesting. The leading arm on both were fine. Irregardless, I ordered a full rebuild kit from Pure Motorsports. It's less expensive to buy the whole kit rather than the outer spherical bearings separately. So if anyone is looking for 4 OEM-style inner bushings, hit me up. Here's a comparison shot of a poly bushing on the right next to the OEM-style bonded rubber bushing. Notice the poly bushing has waffling on its inner bore. This is to hold a lubricant, and you can see they're significantly worn. I would say this bushing has at least 50,000 miles of use on it. To remove the bushings from the end of the control arm, you'll need a bushing removal kit like this one I'm using. It consists of 2 cups, one larger than the bearing and one slightly smaller than its outside diameter. You're essentially pressing the bushing out and into the larger cup. It's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle at first, finding the right cup size and assembling everything. The kit I have is a cheap version from China with horrific ball bearings which tend to disintegrate fairly quickly. Just lube everything up and you can forego the bearings if need be. Alignment is fairly critical, so just take it slow until things start to move in the right direction. And yes, they'll slingshot out the end. I usually do this on the ground, but I did it up high for filming reasons. You're welcome. The next big challenge is getting the new poly bushings in. These are from Powerflex, which I believe is a UK-based company. They have 2 different offerings, the purple street version and the black race version. Visit the UK website first. They list the RS5 application, which the US site does not. Irregardless, they all use the same bushing, so just purchase the S5 version if you're in the United States. I've listed the link in the video description below. Navigating to the site, select Audi, scrolling down until you find the A5 S5 RS5 link, and then choosing the RS5. Basic stuff. Clicking on the diagram, they have lots of offerings, but we're looking for the number 3 diagram. There they are. These are the race versions. Scrolling down, there's a description of the difference between the race and the street version. Good stuff. Very informative. Moving on. Getting the oversized bushings in is a bit more difficult and a bit of a balancing act. Powerflex advises to start them in at an angle, stating the rest of the bushing will then slip in. Sure enough, it worked. I did lube everything with a bit of some of that magical Krytox stuff though. I ended up using several different cup sizes on the receiving end to get the bushings to fully seat with both outer lips positioned on either side of the control arm. This took a bit of patience at worst. I also used the cups to install the steel center bushing. I made sure to lube up the center board of the poly bushing, filling the waffling with the included PTFE grease. The outboard Aurora bearings were the exact opposite. While exactly one came out with a dead blow plastic hammer, the rest required PB blasters, aka penetrating fluid, which I let sit overnight. Alternatively, you could try freezing the arms for a few hours to break the corrosion bonding between the 2 metal pieces. As the metal contracts, it will break that bond. But before you can actually remove the bearings, Each are held in place by a constant radius snap ring. Unfortunately, there are no small holes for removal, so use a screwdriver gingerly. These control arms have been serviced before, and whoever did the work managed to scar them up. As I mentioned before, after removing the snap rings, I doused them in penetrating fluid and let them sit overnight. The next day, I placed the nose in a vise and gave it a solid love tap with a dead blow hammer. After disassembly, I'd found that someone had added a good-sized dab of grease. This is actually something you do not want to do, as the petroleum-based grease can wear down the inner Teflon lining of the bearing. These bearings are proprietary and made by a company called Aurora. They're about $45 a pop. The freezer trick I mentioned earlier can be used to insert the new bearings. By freezing them, they contract to their lowest possible outside diameter. Make sure to clean the receiving cup on the control arms thoroughly. With the new bearings nice and cold, you can press them in gingerly with the use of a vise. Work your way around the radius until it's fully seated. With the bearings in place, install the snap rings and you're good to go. The reinstallation process will take a zen-like patience at times. It can be difficult to line everything up to make the bolt insertion easier. I ended up using my camera phone to see if the control arm bushing center bore was aligned with the holes in the chassis mounting tabs. The springs being in the way compounds the issue, and I found it necessary to lower the spring perch and afford myself more room to align the bolt correctly. Strangely, I did not have this problem on the passenger side. If you're still rocking the original suspension or lowering springs, your mileage and level of frustration may vary. One tip, don't tighten the inner control arm bolts just yet. Do so after you've installed the outer spherical bearing into the suspension upright. The suspension upright pinch bolt setup can be a bit frustrating if you're stubborn like me. Ideally, one would simply loosen the jam nuts on the turnbuckle, allowing the alignment of both spherical bearing noses and easily pressing them into the upright receptacles. Both noses must be aligned perfectly parallel in order to push them into the upright. I could have just marked the control arm's adjustable position and returned them to the original position after installing the pinch bolt. I could have done a lot of things, but I chose to keep everything as is. This perpetuated a lot of swearing, raising and lowering of the suspension, and even turning the steering wheel. Eventually, they went in and all was right in the world. The pinch bolt locking nut is torqued to 40 Newton meters or 29.5 foot-pounds of torque. Not a whole lot. Strangely enough, the factory service manual does not list a torque specification for the upper control arm inner bolts. This means snug them good and tight with wrenches. This is especially applicable to the OEM-style bonded rubber bushings. The suspension should be raised to ride height before tightening the two inner nuts. Using a solid point on the lower control arm, jack the vehicle up until it begins to lift off the jack stand. Tighten the nut on either control arm. The original bushings only have so much deflection, and failure to do this will result in premature tear. Theoretically, the new poly bushings are free to rotate 360 degrees without tearing. Nonetheless, I did position the suspension at ride height mostly out of superstition. If there is one area which does wear on these types of bushings, it's the inner waffling as it rotates around the metal bearing. So how much time did this take? If you're just replacing the inner bushings on stock control arms, give yourself about 4 hours to do this task. This is assuming you do not have to lower the suspension. If you're rebuilding everything as I did, add another 2 hours to be safe, minus whatever time needed for penetration fluid and or freezing your bearings. Just to put a timestamp on this video, I'm currently not driving as much due to COVID-19. With that said, I have taken the car out since installing the bushings, and I can report my car turns as well to the right as it does to the left. So far, I cannot detect any additional noise or harshness, and the car did gain a bit more precise just off-center steering reaction, something I find lacking in the RS5. I will of course have updates in the future to keep everyone informed on the viability of this mod. As always, thanks for watching. I have links in the video description down below for everything mentioned in the video, including some of my favorite shops and products. Be sure to pay them all a visit. And please stay safe out there. Ape Factory out.